Part 1. The Billionaire's Big Mistake. The deal that would change everything. Billionaire Ethan Caldwell had a simple philosophy. If you want something, take it. He had built an empire from the ground up. He controlled dozens of luxury developments across the country. And now? He was about to finalize his next big project, a high-rise condominium in the heart of the city. The only problem? The old hotel standing in his way, and more specifically, the last tenant inside it. One man against a billionaire. The Montrose Hotel had been abandoned for years. Every other tenant had been paid off. Every legal loophole had been closed. Ethan Caldwell owned the land, almost, but one man refused to leave, a homeless man named Joseph Grant. To Ethan, he was nothing more than an inconvenience, a relic from the past, a squatter who had no business standing in the way of progress. Ethan's lawyers assured him, "It's a done deal. We'll have him out within days." They were wrong. The first confrontation. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to deal with obstacles from a distance. So one afternoon, he arrived at the Montrose Hotel himself. His luxury SUV pulled up to the crumbling building, his team of lawyers and security following closely behind. Inside? A single man sat in the dusty lobby. Joseph Grant. Gray beard, tattered clothes, a weathered face, a duffel bag beside him, the only thing he owned, and eyes that carried a wisdom Ethan didn't recognize. Ethan didn't bother with small talk. "You have 24 hours to leave," he said. "I own this building now. There's a check waiting for you, enough to get a fresh start. Take it, before I make this difficult." Joseph glanced up, his expression calm. "You don't own this building," he said simply. Ethan laughed. "Actually, I do. I bought it last month. The paperwork is ironclad." Joseph leaned back in his chair. "See, that's where you're wrong." Ethan's smile faded, because something about the way Joseph said it, so confidently, so casually, felt off, like he knew something Ethan didn't. The first warning sign. Ethan's top lawyer, Anthony Reese, stepped forward. "Mr. Grant, I suggest you take the deal. We've reviewed every legal detail. This building is now Mr. Caldwell's property. You are, quite frankly, trespassing." Joseph smirked. "Then call the cops." Anthony hesitated. Ethan stiffened. "You think I won't?" Ethan snapped. "Fine. You had your chance." He turned to one of his security guards. "Call the police. Now." The guard nodded and stepped outside. A few minutes later, no sirens, no flashing lights, no officers arriving to remove Joseph. Just silence. Joseph stood up slowly, dusting off his jacket. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" he said. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Should I?" Joseph sighed. "Maybe. You might have read about me once, back when I used to be a high-profile real estate attorney." Anthony's face went pale. Ethan froze. "A real estate attorney? No, but it couldn't be." The past comes back to haunt. Years ago, Joseph Grant had been one of the best. He specialized in property law. He won impossible cases. And he knew every loophole in the book. Then he lost everything. A devastating wrongful conviction had landed him in prison for 5 years. By the time he was released, his career was over. Nobody would hire him. Nobody would give him a second chance. So he disappeared, living in the one place nobody could take from him. Until now. Ethan's stomach twisted. If Joseph Grant was who he claimed to be, then getting him out wouldn't be easy. It would be a legal nightmare. And worse, Joseph already knew that. The first move. Ethan forced a grin. "Fine. You want to play hardball?" he said. We'll see how long you last. You might know property law, but you don't have a dime to your name. I have an army of lawyers. You can't win this fight." Joseph picked up his duffel bag. "See, Ethan, that's your problem," he said, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "You think this is about money." Then he walked past Ethan, calm, collected, in complete control. Ethan watched him go, rage bubbling inside him. This wasn't over, not even close. And when it was done, Joseph Grant would regret ever standing in his way. Or at least, that's what Ethan thought. Because what he didn't know, Joseph Grant had already set the perfect trap. And when Ethan walked into it, it would destroy everything. Part 2. The trap is set. The billionaire's next move. Ethan Caldwell wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He had crushed his competitors. He had manipulated legal systems in multiple states. He had bought judges, politicians, and officials to get what he wanted. And now, he was about to crush Joseph Grant. "This ends now," Ethan growled, storming into his private boardroom. Across the table sat his legal team, the best money could buy. "Tell me how we get him out," Ethan demanded. Anthony Reese, his top attorney, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," he said carefully, "we have a problem." Ethan's jaw clenched. "What kind of problem?" Anthony sighed. "Joseph Grant is still legally a tenant. A loophole no one saw coming." Ethan leaned forward. "That's impossible. We bought the building outright." Anthony swallowed hard. "Yes, but there's an old protection clause in the Montrose Hotel's lease agreements. It states that if a tenant has lived there for over 10 years, they can't be evicted without a direct court order." Ethan's eye twitched. And Joseph Grant has been there for exactly 11 years. Silence. Then Ethan slammed his fist on the table. "That shouldn't matter," he roared. "The city will rule in our favor." Anthony hesitated. "Normally, yes," he admitted. "But—" Ethan glared. "But what?" Anthony took a breath. "Joseph Grant is representing himself." Ethan froze. His entire legal team sat in dead silence, because they all knew what that meant. Joseph wasn't just fighting back. He was about to embarrass them. The courtroom showdown begins. 2 weeks later, Ethan Caldwell walked into court, expecting to see a broken old man. Instead, Joseph Grant sat at the defense table completely composed. His hair was combed, his suit, though worn, was neatly pressed. And the second he looked Ethan in the eye, he smirked. Ethan's blood boiled, but he stayed calm. After all, his legal team had prepared for everything, or so he thought, because the moment the trial began, Joseph flipped the script. Joseph's opening move, the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Carter, tapped her gavel. "Let's get straight to the point," she said. "Mr. Grant, you're facing eviction. Why should this court rule in your favor?" Joseph stood. "Your Honor, I have 2 major arguments." He turned to Ethan's legal team. "First, the Montrose Hotel lease agreement is still active. It states that tenants who have resided there for over 10 years cannot be evicted without due cause." The judge nodded. "That's a valid claim. And the second?" Joseph smiled. "The Montrose Hotel isn't legally owned by Ethan Caldwell." The entire courtroom gasped. Ethan shot up from his seat. "What the hell are you talking about?" Joseph turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A." He held up a folder. Inside, the biggest legal bombshell of the case. The perfect trap. Joseph took a deep breath. Your Honor, this document is the original purchase agreement for the Montrose Hotel. Ethan Caldwell's company, Caldwell Enterprises, claimed to have purchased the building. He walked toward the judge's bench, placing the document down. But there's a problem. The judge flipped through the pages. Joseph continued. Ethan Caldwell's contract states that he purchased the land, but the original owner, a man named Gerald Kingston, never sold him the mineral rights. The judge froze. Ethan's lawyers turned pale. Joseph leaned forward, and per city law, any property purchase without mineral rights means the deed is incomplete. Meaning, he turned to Ethan, you don't own this building. A wave of gasps filled the room. The judge stared at the paperwork. Ethan's legal team scrambled. One of them pulled out their phone, furiously texting. Ethan's hands shook with rage. You had no way of knowing that, he hissed. Joseph shrugged. I used to be one of the best real estate attorneys in the country. You really thought I wouldn't check your contract? Ethan's world was spinning. This was impossible. But Joseph wasn't finished. The final blow. Joseph turned back to the judge. Your Honor, not only is Caldwell Enterprises illegally attempting eviction, but they also falsified their ownership in city records. He held up another folder. Here is proof that they lied on their filings. They claimed to own the full property when in fact they do not. That is grounds for fraud. The judge snapped her gaze to Ethan's lawyers. Is this true? She demanded. Anthony fumbled through his papers. We need time to review the claim. The judge cut him off. Enough. She turned to Joseph. Mr. Grant, based on this evidence, I am granting an immediate injunction. You cannot be removed from this property. Ethan's jaw dropped. The judge wasn't just ruling in Joseph's favor. She was about to go further. Additionally, she continued, I am opening a fraud investigation into Caldwell Enterprises. If these claims hold up, we may be looking at criminal charges. Ethan felt his world collapsing. But Joseph? He just smiled. Because this was only the beginning. Part 3. The final takedown. The fallout begins. Ethan Caldwell stormed out of the courtroom, his mind racing. His billion-dollar project was frozen. His company was under fraud investigation. A homeless man had just humiliated him in front of the entire city. And now, the media was everywhere. Reporters surrounded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing. Social media was blowing up with clips from the trial. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire Caldwell's fraud exposed in court by a former attorney turned homeless man. Joseph Grant versus Ethan Caldwell, the lawsuit that stunned the legal world. Caldwell Enterprises stocks were already crashing. His investors were panicking. His lawyers were scrambling. And worst of all, Joseph Grant wasn't finished. The power shift. Joseph stood outside the courthouse, watching the chaos unfold. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was winning. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. Mr. Grant, what's next for you? How does it feel to defeat a billionaire? Joseph smirked. It's not about winning, he said. It's about justice. Ethan gritted his teeth as he listened from the sidelines. Justice? He had spent his entire career bending the law to his will. And now, some washed-up lawyer thought he could take him down? This wasn't over. Ethan's desperate play. The next morning, Ethan was on the phone with his lawyers. I don't care what it costs, he snapped. Find a way to make this go away. Anthony Reese sighed. Sir, The fraud charges are real. The city is investigating, and if they prove we falsified records—" Ethan cut him off. "Then we fix it." "How?" Ethan leaned back, staring out over the city skyline. "Simple," he said. "We buy him." Joseph Grant was broke. No home, no assets. He wanted justice? Fine. Ethan would wave a blank check in his face and watch him fold. The offer. That afternoon, Joseph sat in the Montrose Hotel lobby when a black SUV pulled up outside. A familiar figure stepped out. Expensive suit. Cold, calculated smile. Ethan Caldwell. Joseph didn't move. Ethan strode in like he still owned the place. He pulled out a folder and dropped it onto the table. "That," he said, "is a contract for $10 million. Joseph raised an eyebrow. "You're paying me to leave?" Ethan smiled. "I'm paying you to disappear, drop the case, sign the contract, walk away. No more lawsuits, no more investigations." Joseph flipped through the papers. The money was real. The deal was airtight. $10 million, more than enough to rebuild his life. Ethan watched closely. "This is more money than you've seen in your entire life," he said. "Take the deal, Grant. Be smart." Joseph set the contract down. Then he laughed. The moment that broke. Ethan Caldwell. Ethan's smirk vanished. Joseph shook his head. "You still don't get it," he said. Ethan leaned forward. "Get what?" Joseph locked eyes with him. This was never about money. Ethan stiffened. Joseph slid the contract back across the table. "You think you're buying my silence? I just took down your entire empire in a courtroom. Do you really think I'd trade that for a payout?" Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "You're making a mistake," he growled. Joseph smirked. "No, Ethan, you made the mistake." Ethan stood abruptly. "Fine. You want war? I'll drag you through the courts for years. You have nothing, no money, no resources." Joseph leaned back, completely unfazed. "You're right about one thing," he said. "I have nothing to lose." Ethan stared at him. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Because money couldn't fix this. Joseph Grant had already won. The final takedown. Days later, Ethan Caldwell was arrested. Fraud charges, tax evasion, forgery. His empire collapsed overnight. Caldwell Enterprises was dismantled. The Montrose Hotel, the city ruled it a historical landmark. Meaning, it could never be demolished. Ethan Caldwell had lost everything. And Joseph Grant? He walked out of court a free man. But as he stepped onto the courthouse steps, a reporter asked, "Mr. Grant, now that you've won, what's next?" Joseph smiled. "I think it's time to practice law again."